During the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union quickly found itself being pushed back as the armies of the Third Reich surged past their border. With the previous non-aggression pact that had carved up the country of Poland between the two powers proving to have been nothing but hollow promises, a defense against the invaders was now the only option. While Soviet tanks such as the KV-1 could hold their own against most of the German tanks of that time, these alone would not be enough to plug the various holes in the Soviet lines which the enemy surged through. Desperate for more tanks to use against their foes, Soviet engineers would rapidly churn out improvised tank destroyers using domestic vehicles. However, this would not just be done with their own designs, as within less than a year the Germans would begin to face a new threat. This time from vehicles of their own design. While today we will be discussing Soviet tank destroyers built using German tanks, these are just some of the many tank destroyers which they would build during the war. They also would pale in comparison to the enormous weaponry of some of them, such as the SU-100Y, which featured a 130mm cannon originally built as a naval gun and used on destroyers. And thanks to today's sponsor, World of Warships, you can put this gun to use against some of the vessels they were intended for. World of Warships is a free-to-play game which allows you to choose between battleships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, cruisers, or submarines to clash against the enemy in online PvP battles. Play by yourself or team up with friends with the constantly evolving battles as new content is added every month. These have included everything from new ships all the way to anime collaborations, which everybody knows you totally just bought as a joke. All of this is done with top-notch graphics on over 40 maps and is available on both console and PC. Try the game for yourself using my link below and the code BRAVO to get a starter pack with 7 days of premium time, 1.5 million credits, 500 doubloons, and the choice between the USS Phoenix, Japanese Kuma, French Corbeil, Italian Dante Alighieri, or HMS Wakeful after playing 15 battles. Thanks again to them for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now let's move back into port as we continue our main topic. The topic of captured vehicles being pressed into service is often brought up in discussions regarding the Second World War. Many of these seem to mainly focus on the ones used by the Germans, particularly the T-34. However, the Germans were far from the only ones to capture significant stocks of enemy vehicles, with the Soviets also building a sizable collection of German vehicles even in the early stages of the invasion. While some of these would be used for testing purposes to help determine weaknesses which Soviet troops could hopefully exploit, functional tanks were at a premium for the Soviets, and it didn't really matter who they originally belonged to. This led to many being pressed into service against their former owners with little more than perhaps a quick coat of paint and some markings to prevent friendly fire. We can see examples of this with many different captured German tanks, even including Panthers and a few Tigers. This was not without problems though, with friendly fire being only one of the list of reasons that prevent captured vehicles from being easily utilized by their new owners even in modern settings. Some of the biggest among these are lack of spare parts as well as the supply of ammunition. While the issue of spare parts is difficult to solve without significant changes to the vehicle, capturing large supplies of parts, or if your military already fields tanks of that type, solutions to maintain a stable supply of ammunition are a bit simpler in comparison. One of the ways to do this is by ripping out the foreign gun and installing a domestic one in its place. While not necessarily a simple process depending on the vehicle, many examples of this can be found throughout history. In fact, the Soviets even put forward the idea of rearming the Tiger tank with a 100mm cannon towards the end of the war. Although that idea would never come to fruition, some conversions were done with earlier Panzer variants, particularly the Panzer III. Making up much of the German armored units, the Panzer III and its half-brother the Sturmgeschutz III were well liked by not just the Germans, but also Soviet crews. Known as T3 for the standard tank and Artsturm, meaning artillery assault tank, for the Sturmgeschutz, these were often pressed into service within a short time following their capture. However, as mentioned earlier, the supplies of ammo for these tanks was inconsistent, relying entirely on captured stocks, meaning a crew could quickly find themselves out of shells. This would eventually lead to one of the first conversions of German armor in the form of the SG-122. The idea of rearming foreign equipment would begin to be tossed around towards the end of 1941 and was not limited to captured tanks. Valentines and Matildas were also considered, with experiments taking place to equip those with domestic weaponry. As for the German equipment, this was considered as well, although development on these would lag slightly, not truly getting started until early in 1942. Originally, discussions included installing a 76mm into the Panzer IV, 45mm into the Panzer III, either a 45mm or a 20mm in the 38T, and a 122mm conversion for the Sturmgeschutz. Out of all these ideas, only the Stug would actually undergo the upgrade, being approved on March 17, 1942. In order to fit the larger 122mm gun, the fighting compartment of the Stug was increased in height, bringing the vehicle to just over 2.2 meters tall. This was done by removing the original casemate roof and replacing it with a taller structure made up of 35mm plates on the front and 25mm plates on the side and rear. With this additional space, they were able to fit in an additional crew member, bringing the count to 5, as well as 50 rounds of ammo for the cannon. This also reportedly made it more comfortable, as despite adding another person, they could more comfortably stand inside it. All these changes increased the weight of the vehicle by around 2.5 tons, and due to the placement of the gun, caused the tank to lean forward, as seen in this photo of the prototype. Trials would find the performance acceptable with a fire rate of 5 to 12 rounds per minute depending on the gun elevation. As to be expected though, additional wear was found on the front road wheels due to the increased pressure placed on them. The first prototype of the SG-122 would be completed towards the end of June 1942, and in total, 21 were built by January of 1943. This number may seem quite low given how simple the conversion was, but a number of factors played into this. These included low numbers of captured tanks delivered to the factory responsible for the conversions, factory number 592, as well as problems during production. Regardless of this, 20 of the SG-122s would reach combat, with the first 14 being delivered in January of 1943. This tour of duty would sadly be short-lived for the SPGs, as many were lost within just a few months. I find it unlikely that these losses were inherently caused by problems with the design, and more likely was due to having so few to begin with at a time when the Soviets were losing large numbers of vehicles of all types. However, the SG-122 did still have a lasting legacy, with the developments for later Soviet SPGs taking cues from the short-lived project. It would also pave the way for another design which saw far more vehicles produced, the SU-76i. This design would essentially take over where the SG-122 left off and was partly responsible for its cancellation. The previous design certainly had its share of flaws, mainly surrounding the weight of the 122mm gun, but showed the potential for using captured equipment in this way. When combined with the poor performance of the early SU-76, this still left a void which the Soviets desperately needed to fill. So once again, the idea of using captured Panzer IIIs began in earnest. For this new tank, the additional crew member was kicked out and a similar angled casemate was placed on top. The height of the vehicle remained roughly the same as its predecessor, but thanks to the smaller armament and lower crew count, significantly more ammunition could be carried. Speaking of the gun, as its name would suggest, the SU-76i was equipped with a 76.2mm gun, more specifically the S1, which was based on the F-34 tank gun and intended specifically for self-propelled guns. The idea was brought before Stalin on January 17, 1943, and the following day he authorized the production of vehicles of this type. Within less than a month, work on a prototype began, being completed in early March. Compared to the SG-122, this conversion was much simpler, requiring minimal modifications to the original Panzer III. This new armored casemate was made up of 4 angled sides. Sources vary on the armor thickness of these, with some giving it 35mm on the front, 25mm on the side, and 15mm on the rear, while an article by Yuri Pashalok on Warspot gives a slightly thicker amount, with 45 to 60mm on the front, 25 to 30mm on the sides, 25mm on the rear, and 10mm on the roof. Without access to the original documentation these numbers are pulled from, or the ability to measure one of the surviving vehicles, I cannot say for sure who is correct. Regardless though, this provided a reasonable level of protection for the crew, at least against smaller caliber weapons and shrapnel. Interestingly, some sources also mention that due to the roof being simply bolted on rather than welded, some crews chose to remove the roof during the warmer months. Following the delivery and testing of the prototype in early March, production of the vehicles would begin with the designation of SU-76i, with the I standing for Inostranaia, or foreign. Reportedly, a total of 201 of these tanks would be built by the end of their production run in November of 1943, with one of those being the prototype and 20 being command versions. These command tanks were essentially the same as their standard siblings, but featured some alterations to allow mounting of a commander's cupola and improved radio along with a reduced ammo supply. These vehicles would begin to be delivered to troops as early as June of 1943, with their first use in combat being in mid-August. Their performance in combat seems to be reasonably good, with reports of successful attacks which they participated in. One photo even shows an example which was recaptured by the Germans and pressed back into service. The main problem which plagued them was quite fitting given their German heritage: lack of spare parts. This led to many of the vehicles being taken out of action temporarily, or in some cases permanently, due to mechanical failures. With the domestic SU-76 now having been mostly resolved of its problems, the usefulness of these vehicles quickly ran out and the production stopped. It is unclear exactly when these vehicles were phased out of their combat roles, but they stayed there at least until early 1944, when the remaining vehicles were transferred to training regiments. These would remain in use until the end of 1945, when they were scrapped, with the exception of one example which reportedly remained at Kubinka until the late 60s, until it too was written off. I assume this means it too was scrapped, but I am unsure. There was one additional attempt to upgrade the SU-76Is in September of 1943, with the proposal to replace the 76mm with an 85mm cannon. This was fairly short-lived and never progressed to a prototype due to problems with the production of the standard SU-76i and shortages of 85mm cannons. Today, 2 examples of the SU-76i remain, with one in Moscow and another in Ukraine. Additionally, a replica of a command SU-76i exists at the Museum of Military Equipment Battle Glory of the Urals in Russia. As for its predecessor, the SG-122, none seem to have survived the war, although a reproduction does exist at the UMMC Museum Complex in Russia. Although they may have been short-lived compared to domestic Soviet designs, these Soviet Stugs represent both ways that a country can repurpose captured equipment, as well as what is sometimes necessary when a country's industry is pushed to its breaking point by war. As with the ZIS-30 and HTZ-16 we have already discussed previously, these may not have been the best vehicles of their time, but they were certainly better than nothing. I want to know what you think of these vehicles though, so let me know down in the comments. And while you're down there, don't forget to give World of Warships a try using my link and the code BRAVO for that free starter pack. Thanks again to them for helping to support my content. As always, a huge thanks as well to my ConelyFans who also help keep the lights on through their support. I hope you all enjoyed, and if you did, please be sure to check out my previous Cursed by Design episodes on some of the other funky Soviet tank destroyers such as the ZIS-30, or maybe something a little stranger like the failed British Cold War mine-clearing project known as the MRV. I hope to see you there or on the next video.